So we're treading kind of close to the argument you got into with Sam Harris about the nature of truth, and since I heard that, I've been sort of itching to have this conversation with you because I think there's a way of viewing this that will actually perhaps reconcile the 2 points of view, but there's a bitter pill that comes along with it. So here's my argument. We tend to think of intellect as having evolved because knowing what's true gives you an advantage. But there's actually nothing that says that the literal truth is where advantage lies. And so I have a category that I call literally false, metaphorically true. These are ideas that aren't true in the factual sense, but they are true enough that if you behave as if they were true, you come out ahead of where you would be if you behaved according to the fact that they're not true. So let me give you a couple of trivial examples that won't be controversial. Porcupines can throw their quills. It's not true. However, if you live near porcupines and you imagine that porcupines can throw their quills, you'll give them some space. If you don't, you may, realizing that they can't throw their quills, get really close to one, and it may wheel around and nail you with a porcupine quill, which can be extremely dangerous because they are microscopically designed to move in from where they puncture you over time, and they can puncture a vital organ or you can get an infection. So the person who believes that a porcupine can throw their quills has an advantage that isn't predicated on the fact that this is actually a literal truth, right? Another one might be people say everything happens for a reason, right? Well, unless you're talking about physics as the reason, everything doesn't happen for a reason. However, if you are the kind of person who believes that everything happens for a reason, and then some terrible tragedy befalls you, you may be on the lookout. Well, what's the reason that this happened? Maybe it's supposed to open some opportunity, and you won't miss that opportunity the way somebody who was preoccupied with their misfortune would. So, literal falseness, but metaphorical truth is actually, I would argue, the category under which religious truth evolves. Now, the problem, the bitter pill that I mentioned, is that I've heard you say that the truths that are captured in the religious version of things are basically like, there's an individual truth, and then there's a truth of your family, and there's a truth of the population that you're living in, and these things are all encoded in these doctrines, which is true, and you would expect it to be because the doctrines are carried along in the population. The problem is, what I hear you arguing, and you tell me if I have it wrong, is that we should therefore expect the encoded metaphorical truths in these religious traditions to be morally right. But there's nothing that actually says it will be morally right, because there are metaphorical truths that might in fact be reprehensible, but nonetheless effective. And so what I would argue, the overarching point here would be that you're right that the documents that contain these descriptions of things are full of things that are true in some sense that is not literal scientific truth, nor was that their purpose. What isn't true is that those things are inherently up to date.
First of all, the first thing about that is that a discussion like that, and this is also what happened with Sam Harris, takes me to the very limits of my intellectual ability. And so even in discussing it, I'm going to make all sorts of mistakes because it's treacherous territory. But I would say my understanding of the great myths has that observation built into it. So one of the archetypes is that of the tyrannical father, which is the archetype, by the way, that possesses the minds of people who accuse Western society of being patriarchal. They're possessed by a singular archetype, and that's the archetype of the tyrannical father. They don't see that there's a tyrannical father and a wise king, because there is. That's you can't even point that out. But anyways, in some of our oldest stories, there's a representation of the dead past. So let me give you an example that everyone knows about. The story of Pinocchio is the story of the individualization of Pinocchio. He starts out as a puppet. He's a marionette. He's a wooden head. He's a liar. And he's pulled by forces that he does not understand. Right, okay, but he has a good father. That's Geppetto. And so he's got and Geppetto wishes that he becomes a real individual. And he knows that that's an impossible wish. He wishes on a star that his son could become an actual individual, knowing full well that that's unlikely and impossible. So Geppetto is a good king. But the story is also about Geppetto, because what happens is that when Geppetto loses Pinocchio, loses his son, which you could think about as the active, dynamic, attentive force of youth, then he ends up stultified in the belly of a whale, which is a symbol of chaos, at the bottom of the ocean, and then Pinocchio has to rescue him. So I would say there is an instantiation of evolutionarily accumulated wisdom in the great stories of the past, but they're still dead. And it requires the union. This is why in Christian theology, the Godhead has a tripartite structure. This is part of the reason. There's God the Father, but the Father's dead. The Father was right 100 years ago or 1,000 years ago and is still partly right, but he's dead. He can't participate in the updating of the process, so you need an active force. Now, the active force is the same thing that generated those stories across time, right? So it's the same thing, except it's also alive in the present. And so your moral duty, and this is another thing that happens in Pinocchio, is to rescue your dead father from the belly of the whale. And that's partly what I'm trying to do with these biblical lectures, because your objection is correct. The reason it's correct is because even if the solution was correct, the landscape has changed. And it's changed incrementally or in a revolutionary way. We don't know. And so those old truths are at best partial and at worst blind. But that doesn't mean you can just say, like Mao did during the Cultural Revolution, well, let's just destroy the past. It's like, no, that would be like saying, well, you don't need a body anymore, because your body is the collected wisdom of the evolutionary process across 3.5 billion years.
I absolutely agree. Because the stories are not literal, it's impossible to know whether well, not impossible, but very difficult to know whether or not the truth that is contained metaphorically is still relevant, if it's been inverted and it's now absolutely false,
So Carl Jung talked about this a lot, hey? And one of the things he said was that your moral duty is to realize the archetype in the confines of your own life. And so you say, well, there's an archetype of perfection that pervades the West, and for the sake of argument, I'm going to call that Christ, the Christ image. It's something like that. That's the archetypal image. Now, we have a story about what Christ's historical life was like. Well, you can't have that life, because you would have had to be in the Middle East 2,000 years ago. That's not your life. But what you can do is take the archetype and you can manifest it within the confines of your own life. And what that does is force you to undergo the difficult process of updating the ancient wisdom. And you don't just forego it. You can't, or you can, but you'll pay a massive price. And part of that will be social disintegration, because it's the past is alive enough so that those of us who inhabit its corpse aren't clawing each other to death while we're feeding, right? That's the critical issue. Now, it's not alive enough because the bloody thing could fall apart at any moment, and we need to be awake and alert in order to keep it updated and maintained.
Well, not only that, but the greatest hazards to us in the present are only partially going to be dealt with in these texts, and that's my biggest concern, is that, if we take Dawkins dismissing religion as mind virus, this is very dangerous because it neglects the truth that you're talking about. And it prevents us from getting to a conversation in which we can talk about the fact that religious texts, religions, are not mind viruses. They are adaptations to past environments. They do contain a kind of truth that isn't necessarily literal and is in general not literal. But none of them, no ancient religion is up to date for Google's algorithms being the hazard to civilization that it probably is. We need to figure out how to navigate where the ancestral wisdom is simply not up to the current challenges.
Okay, so let me modify that slightly, because I think it's true and not true. The stories are erroneous in detail and right in pattern. So, for example, there's an idea that one of the things that the mythological hero does is stand up against the tyranny of the state. Now, you don't have to specify the nature of the tyranny of the state in order for that to be a truth that's applicable across different contexts. And I would say what's happened with the great religious myths is that they operate at a level of abstraction such that the abstract entities are applicable in every single environment. I'll give you an example of that. It is extremely useful to represent the phenomenology of your experience as a domain of chaos and order. That works in every single environment for every person. And so the domain of order, I can describe it technically. You're in the domain of order when Your actions produce the result you desire. And you're in the domain of chaos when they don't. And then I could say, well, your task is to straddle the border between those two domains, because you don't always want to be where everything that you're doing is working, because you don't learn anything. And you don't want to be where nothing you're doing is working, because it's overwhelming. You want to be stable and dynamic at the same point. And the Taoists do that very nicely, because they have a chaos order conceptualization of the phenomenological landscape. And their claim is the point of maximum proper being is right at the center of the border between chaos and order. And I think that's true across contexts. So I don't think that truth ages.